54 days. That's how long the United States and Iran have been at war. Not a proxy war, not a shadow conflict played out through intermediaries. A real, declared, devastating war. One that has already reshaped the Middle East, rattled the global economy, and forced every nation on Earth to choose a side, or desperately try not to. To understand where we are today, you need to understand the road that brought us here. The story doesn't begin on February 28, 2026, the day American and Israeli jets streaked toward Tehran. It begins years earlier, with a nuclear deal that collapsed and was never replaced. With Iran's proxy network being systematically dismantled, Hezbollah weakened, Hamas ground down in Gaza, Assad gone from Syria. With Iran's economy strangled by sanctions so severe that by late 2025, the Iranian rial had collapsed to over 1.4 million to the dollar. By December 2025, Iranians had flooded the streets in all 31 provinces, the largest protests since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The government's response was brutal, killing at least 30,000 civilians according to Iran's own Ministry of Health. And it was at that moment, at 3 a.m. Washington time, that Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, "If Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Thank you for your attention to this matter." That was January 2nd, 2026. The war had not yet started, but the signal had been sent. Then, on February 28th, 2026, while Iran and the U.S. were still technically in indirect negotiations in Oman, the strikes began. American and Israeli warplanes struck military sites across Iran. Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Senior government officials were assassinated. It was a surprise attack, launched during negotiations. Iran answered within hours. Ballistic missiles and drones rained down on U.S. bases in Jordan, the UAE, and Qatar. Iranian forces struck energy infrastructure across Gulf nations, allies of America who had not asked for this war and did not want it. And then came the move that sent shockwaves around the entire world. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of all the world's oil. Gone. Overnight. The International Energy Agency called what followed the single largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Brent crude surged from under $80 a barrel to past $120 within days. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all exports. Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE collectively lost 6.7 million barrels per day of production by mid-March. And for the Gulf states, nations that import over 80% of their food through the Strait of Hormuz, it became something even more personal than an energy crisis. It became a food crisis. By mid-March, 70% of Gulf food imports were disrupted. Supermarket shelves emptied. Retailers were airlifting basic staples. Consumer prices spiked by 40 to 120% almost overnight. Citizens of some of the wealthiest nations on Earth were struggling to buy bread. The Trump administration offered several explanations for starting the war, sometimes in the same week. To prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon, to destroy Iran's missile capabilities, to seize Iran's oil resources, to achieve regime change. Iranian officials, and some American officials, disputed that any imminent attack had been planned. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation. The war had begun, and through all of it, Trump kept posting. On April 5th, hours after U.S. forces completed a dangerous rescue mission to recover a downed airman from the mountains of Iran, Trump unleashed a profanity-filled rant on Truth Social, warning Iran about the strait and injecting new volatility into a conflict that diplomats were desperately trying to contain. Then came the post that stunned the world. About 12 hours before his own Tuesday night deadline for Iran to capitulate, Trump wrote, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. Democratic rivals called it sick. They called it genocidal. The United Nations pointed out that even if civilian infrastructure qualified as a legitimate military target, international humanitarian law still applied. And Iran, ancient Persia, heir to one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, heard the threat and did not bend. Then came April 8th. At midnight exactly, the tone shifted completely. Trump posted what sounded almost like optimism. A big day for world peace. Iran wants it to happen. They had enough. Likewise, so has everyone else. The United States of America will be helping with the traffic buildup in the Strait of Hormuz. There will be lots of positive action. Big money will be made. Hours later, he threatened new strikes. This is the pattern that has defined the entire diplomatic landscape of this war. A swing from threat to hope and back to threat, sometimes within a single morning. On April 16th, Trump declared on Truth Social that U.S. forces were, and here he capitalized every letter, locked and loaded, and our military will finish up the little that is left of Iran. At a tax event in Nevada that same week, he told the crowd, "The war in Iran is going along swimmingly." When critics questioned why the war hadn't ended in 6 weeks, as some had expected, Trump pushed back, writing that Democrats like to say he promised 6 weeks to defeat Iran, and that from the military standpoint it was far faster than that. But he wasn't going to let them rush the United States into a deal that wasn't as good as it could be. He added, "I am under no pressure whatsoever, although it will all happen relatively quickly." On the media, he was direct. The anti-America fake news media is rooting for Iran to win, but it's not going to happen because I'm in charge. On Israel's role, he rejected any suggestion that Washington had been dragged into the conflict. Israel never talked me into the war with Iran. The results of October 7th added to my lifelong opinion that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. On the deal he hopes will end the war, he was unambiguous. The deal that we're making with Iran will be far better than the JCPOA, one of the worst deals ever made having to do with the security of our country. On Iran's economic suffering under the blockade, blunt and almost clinical, they're losing $500 million a day, an unsustainable number, even in the short run. And in one of his most expansive posts, spanning more than 900 words, Trump declared he would not be rushed. Time is not my adversary. The only thing that matters is that we finally, after 47 years, straighten out the mess that other presidents let happen because they didn't have the courage or foresight to do what had to be done with respect to Iran. These posts are not just rhetoric. They are policy. They are negotiation. They are, for better or worse, the way this president conducts diplomacy in the information age. And here's the problem. Multiple senior U.S. officials, speaking anonymously to the Wall Street Journal and to CNN, have warned that Trump's Truth Social posts are actively undermining the peace process. His threats and boasts are making it politically impossible for Iranian negotiators to return to the table without appearing to capitulate to public humiliation. A 2-week ceasefire had been brokered by Pakistan, with Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. It was announced on April 7th. Trump extended it on April 22nd. But the naval blockade of Iranian ports remains. Iran calls that a ceasefire violation. Talks in Islamabad on April 11th ended without progress. As of today, the ceasefire holds, but only barely. Now let's talk about the layer of this conflict that most news coverage skips past. The petrodollar. For 50 years, the architecture of global finance has rested on a specific arrangement. Oil, the world's most essential commodity, is priced and traded in U.S. dollars. This means that every nation on Earth that needs oil must hold U.S. dollars to buy it. The demand for dollars is therefore perpetual, structural, and enormous. This system keeps U.S. Treasury bonds in demand globally. It funds America's ability to run massive deficits without triggering currency collapse. It is, in essence, one of the deep foundations of American financial power. Iran, sitting astride the Strait of Hormuz, controls the single most important choke point in this entire system. By closing the strait, Iran doesn't just disrupt oil flows. It attacks the very mechanism by which the petrodollar functions. It creates uncertainty. It forces nations to scramble for alternatives. It gives China and Russia an opening they've been waiting decades for. When Iran controls that choke point, it can bypass sanctions, undermine the petrodollar system, and deepen ties with China, not necessarily destroying the system outright, but inflicting a serious, lasting cost on American financial dominance. And the markets have felt it. J.P. Morgan Global Research warns that if elevated oil prices persist through mid-2026, global GDP growth could be depressed by nearly 1% on an annualized basis, and global inflation could rise by more than 1 percentage point. Central banks that were cautiously cutting interest rates are now reconsidering. The 1970s energy crisis echoes loudly here. Supply shocks, currency volatility, the specter of stagflation, inflation and recession arriving simultaneously. The worst of all worlds for policymakers. Perhaps the most extraordinary substory in all of this is what has happened to America's Gulf allies. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. These nations did not ask for this war. They did not sanction it, encourage it, or want it. And yet Iranian missiles struck their territory. Ballistic projectiles targeted Riyadh. Qatar's sovereignty was violated. Their food supplies were disrupted. Their oil exports were stranded. Their initial reaction? They condemned the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. But then Iran struck them. By March 16th, the Gulf states had reversed course, urging the United States to neutralize Iran. Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE all condemned the Iranian strikes publicly and in stark terms. Several brought a case to the UN Human Rights Council over attacks on civilian infrastructure. And yet, beneath those official statements, the Gulf states are deeply and existentially rattled. Their economic model, built on oil exports, sovereign wealth funds, and stability, has experienced what analysts are calling a systemic collapse. The UAE and Qatar, who spent years carefully balancing relationships with Washington and Beijing, are now watching the consequences of proximity to the U.S. in a hot war. The food crisis has made this visceral and personal for ordinary Gulf citizens in a way that no diplomatic briefing ever could. Gulf leaders are quietly asking themselves a question that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Can we continue to rely exclusively on American security guarantees? Is our strategic alignment with Washington actually serving our people? These are the questions that will reshape the Gulf's geopolitical orientation for the next generation. Now let's talk about the two powers watching all of this most carefully. Russia. Moscow condemned the U.S.-Israeli strikes as armed aggression and demanded an immediate halt. But Russia has not intervened militarily. It doesn't need to. Every day this war continues, Russia benefits. Oil prices stay elevated, meaning revenue for Russia despite Western sanctions. American attention and resources are consumed in the Middle East, reducing focus on Ukraine. The global narrative of American unilateralism is reinforced without Russia firing a single shot. Moscow has also been quietly advancing a north-south trade corridor connecting Russia to the Indian Ocean through Iran and India, a route designed explicitly to bypass the Western-dominated global trade system. This war has added enormous urgency to that project. China's position is more complex and ultimately more consequential. Beijing condemned the military action as a violation of international law. Foreign Minister Wang made 26 phone calls to parties across the region. China's special envoy traveled to the Middle East. China and Pakistan issued a joint 5-point peace initiative. Beijing is positioning itself as the responsible global power, the peacemaker, the adult in the room, a deliberate and calculated contrast with American behavior. But China's interest goes far deeper than optics. China imports enormous quantities of Middle Eastern oil. It has deep economic ties with Iran. The two countries signed a 25-year cooperation agreement worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The disruption of the Strait of Hormuz hits Chinese energy supply chains hard and immediately. And yet China also sees a historic opportunity. If the petrodollar system is destabilized, if Gulf states begin to question their alignment with Washington, if the yuan can slowly expand its role in energy transactions, all of that serves China's long-term strategic interest in reshaping the global financial order. China's limitation is structural. Because the yuan cannot be freely exchanged at market rates, due to Chinese capital controls, it cannot simply replace the dollar overnight. The dollar's dominance also rests on the depth and liquidity of U.S. financial markets, something China cannot replicate quickly. But this war is accelerating a long-term shift that was already underway. The direction of travel is becoming clearer to every finance ministry on the planet. So what does all of this mean for you? For the world? Energy prices will remain elevated for months, possibly much longer. Even a ceasefire does not reopen the strait overnight. The mines are still there, and the tensions are real. Shell's chief executive has warned of European fuel shortages. British supermarkets are already reporting fuel station constraints. Gas prices in the United States peaked at over $4 a gallon, and experts say it will take months to return to anything approaching normal. Inflation is coming back. Higher energy costs feed into everything: transport, manufacturing, food production, heating. Central banks that were cautiously cutting interest rates will now pause or reverse. For ordinary families in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, this means higher costs for the basic materials of daily life. Global business confidence has been shaken. European business output fell for the first time in 16 months in April 2026. Supply chain diversification, already accelerating after the pandemic, will now move faster and further than most companies had planned. The geopolitical order is fracturing further. The war has exposed the limits of American power, specifically the gap between the ability to start a conflict and the ability to end one cleanly. It has accelerated the conversation about alternatives to the dollar. It has given China and Russia meaningful strategic leverage. It has strained relationships with Gulf allies who were supposed to be pillars of American influence in the region. And it has drawn Pakistan into a central diplomatic role, elevating Islamabad in ways that will have consequences across South Asia for years. And perhaps most importantly for the long term, this war is testing whether the petrodollar system, the foundation of American financial power for 50 years, can survive a sustained challenge. It probably can. The dollar is deeply entrenched in global trade and finance. But every month of disruption is a month in which alternatives are being explored, relationships are being redrawn, and precedents are being set that will be difficult to reverse. As of today, 4 paths lie ahead. The first, a deal is reached. Negotiations resume in good faith. The strait reopens fully. Oil prices fall. Markets stabilize. A frozen conflict emerges. No formal peace treaty, but an end to active hostilities and a return to the kind of tense coexistence the world managed for decades. This is the best case. It is possible. It is not guaranteed. The second, the ceasefire holds, but nothing is resolved. The conflict continues in a low-grade form. The naval blockade, the minefields, the economic pressure slowly grinding both sides down. Iran exhausts itself slowly. The U.S. exhausts its political will slowly. A messy, protracted standoff with no clear winner and oil prices that remain elevated for years. Markets adapt, but never fully recover their pre-war confidence. The third, the ceasefire collapses. Iran fires on U.S. naval vessels. Trump posts. Escalation resumes at full intensity. The economic damage deepens catastrophically. The risk of a wider regional war, with Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen all drawn in, becomes acute. Global shipping routes are disrupted not just in the Gulf, but potentially further. This is the scenario that keeps economists and military planners awake at night, and it is not a remote possibility. The fourth, regime change, controlled or chaotic. The combination of military defeat, economic collapse under the blockade, and ongoing internal protests leads to a change in Iran's government. Washington has signaled this is among its goals. Whether that produces a stable, friendly successor state or a catastrophic power vacuum that destabilizes the entire region is deeply uncertain. Every historical precedent from the last 30 years of American-led regime change suggests the outcome would be complex, prolonged, and costly for everyone, including the United States. We are living through a hinge moment in history. The U.S.-Iran war is not just a conflict between two countries. It is a stress test of the entire global order that emerged from World War II and was reinforced after the Cold War. A test of dollar power. A test of whether American military force can translate into political outcomes. A test of whether the Middle East's extraordinary geography, its oil, its straits, its ancient civilizations, can be managed without catastrophe in an era of great power competition. The people of Iran are suffering. The people of the Gulf are suffering. Families across the world are paying more for fuel, for food, for the basic materials of daily life. And the diplomats are still talking, which means, at least, that hope has not been fully extinguished. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz in the coming weeks will reverberate through global markets, supply chains, and geopolitics for years. Pay attention, because whether you live in London, Lagos, Mumbai, or Manila, what happens there is already happening to you.